first time an old mud dauber nest got cracked open, the expectation was simple: dirt, maybe some dust, nothing remarkable. But instead the chamber was packed with spiders, dozens of them, motionless bodies preserved so perfectly it looked like time itself had paused inside that little tube of hardened mud. And that's the moment it became clear these strange lumps stuck to walls and sheds aren't nests in the way most people picture a nest at all. Because that small patch of dirt is actually hiding one of the most sophisticated survival strategies found anywhere in the insect world, a carefully engineered structure that functions simultaneously as a nursery and a biological storage vault. And inside it sits something almost nobody expects. So today the plan is to take a close look at the secret life of the mud dauber, examine why its nest ends up packed with spiders, and explain why this particular wasp, despite carrying a stinger, tends to be one of the most beneficial insects a property owner could have around. And by the end, there's a good chance those rough little mud tubes will never look the same way again. At first glance, a mud dauber nest looks completely unimpressive, rough, uneven, almost like someone flung a handful of wet clay against a wall and simply wandered off without a second thought. Nothing about its appearance suggests intelligence or engineering of any kind. But that impression changes entirely the moment you actually watch one being constructed, because unlike yellow jackets, hornets, or most of the wasps people are generally familiar with, mud daubers are solitary insects through and through. There's no queen directing operations, no worker caste supporting a shared colony. Every single task falls on one individual female. She alone is responsible for the entire project from start to finish, flying repeatedly to puddles, muddy stream banks, and patches of wet soil, gathering tiny pellets of mud one at a time, then carrying each pellet back to the build site, one trip then another then another. Sometimes dozens of trips in total, sometimes considerably more, slowly and methodically shaping the material layer by layer into a series of narrow internal chambers. And here's the part that makes this whole process genuinely remarkable. She isn't constructing a home for herself at all. She's building a nursery for offspring she will never personally meet or interact with in any way. But that's really only half the story, because this structure doubles as something else entirely, a stocked pantry, and by the time a given chamber is finished, it may already contain a dozen or more spiders that are strangely enough still technically alive. And this runs completely counter to how most animals approach reproduction, since typically food gets gathered after offspring arrive and need to be fed, but mud daubers reverse that order entirely, stocking the pantry first and only afterward laying an egg. And the food source itself is spiders, a great many spiders, with the female essentially becoming a highly specialized hunter for this specific purpose, searching walls, sheds, garages, crawl spaces, and any hidden corner where a spider might be tucked away. And when she locates one, she strikes with remarkable precision, delivering venom that doesn't kill the spider outright but instead paralyzes it completely, leaving it alive yet totally unable to move or escape while still remaining biologically fresh. And she then drags that paralyzed spider back to the nest before heading right back out to hunt again, repeating the process over and over, one spider becoming several, several becoming many, until the chamber is entirely filled. And only at that point does she finally lay a single egg inside, seal the chamber shut with a fresh layer of mud, and depart for good, never to return to that particular chamber again. It's worth pausing on that for a moment, because that unremarkable-looking mud tube stuck to the side of a house is functionally a living refrigerator, a storage vault filled with spiders kept in a kind of suspended, preserved state. And long before humans ever developed refrigeration technology, nature had already arrived at a strikingly similar solution on its own: keep the food source alive, simply incapable of moving. Naturally, if wasps in general make people uneasy, a reasonable question comes up here. If this particular insect is already hunting spiders using venom and carries a functional stinger, why wouldn't it turn that same defense mechanism on people as readily as other wasps sometimes do? And the answer tends to surprise a lot of homeowners once they hear it, because mud daubers rank among the least aggressive wasps anyone is likely to encounter, with many entomologists describing them almost affectionately as the introverts of the wasp world, a description that fits remarkably well once you understand their behavior, since the wasps most commonly associated with painful encounters, yellow jackets, hornets, and paper wasps, are all social species defending an entire colony, a queen, and potentially thousands of developing offspring, meaning that when a threat appears near their nest, they have something substantial worth defending aggressively. But mud daubers have none of that at stake. There's no colony, no queen, no reinforcements waiting nearby, just a single female quietly trying to finish her individual task. And to her, a person nearby isn't prey, isn't even really a competitor. She's simply a large moving obstacle in the environment. And in the vast majority of situations, she wants nothing at all to do with any of it unless she's physically trapped or directly handled, since her venom is a valuable, limited resource meant specifically for subduing spiders, not for use against something as large and irrelevant to her goals as a human being, so she overwhelmingly chooses avoidance over any kind of confrontation. Once the idea of the mud dauber as a threat starts to fade, it becomes much easier to actually appreciate the craftsmanship involved in what she's doing. And it's worth paying attention to the sound she makes while building, Since that buzzing isn't just incidental wing noise, as fresh mud gets applied to the structure, vibrations produced by her flight muscles actually help compact and strengthen the material, meaning she's essentially using her own body as a small, built-in vibrating construction tool. With each new layer becoming firmer, and each individual chamber becoming more structurally stable as a result. And what looks like a sloppy, careless lump of dirt from a distance is actually the accumulated result of countless individual trips and many hours of dedicated labor, all invested entirely in offspring she will personally never encounter. Then comes what might be the most unsettling detail in this entire story: the actual contents of these sealed chambers, since most people, if asked to guess what's inside a wasp nest, would probably assume insect larvae, maybe some kind of wax structure, perhaps even honey. But mud dauber nests are entirely different, and cracking open an old, abandoned nest may reveal chamber after chamber filled with spiders, sometimes just a handful, sometimes considerably more, all perfectly preserved and effectively frozen in place, waiting for a young mud dauber that, in many cases, has already completed development and emerged long ago, making this one of the stranger sights available anywhere in the insect world: a hidden stockpile of paralyzed spiders sealed away inside hardened mud. And occasionally, researchers examining these nests have come across something even more notable: black widow spiders specifically, a detail that matters quite a bit, because it shows mud daubers aren't simply grabbing whatever prey happens to be convenient. Certain species, blue mud dauber in particular, have a well-documented tendency to specifically target and hunt black widows, exactly the kind of spider most homeowners would strongly prefer not to have living anywhere near their property. And thinking that through, the unassuming mud nest someone's been meaning to scrape off their garage wall may actually represent clear evidence that an extremely effective spider hunter has been quietly working that exact area for months on end, with no chemicals involved. No traps, no ongoing maintenance, no pest control service calls, just steady, continuous hunting day after day across an entire season, all while most property owners never even realize it's happening right under their nose. So, coming back to the practical question at the center of all this: what should actually be done if a mud dauber nest turns up attached to a house? And the answer tends to be refreshingly simple. If the nest is currently active, the best move is generally to just leave it alone, since the female occupying it is in the middle of completing work that frequently benefits the surrounding area. She isn't establishing some sprawling colony. She isn't recruiting additional wasps to join her. And she's extremely unlikely to cause any trouble for the people living nearby. And eventually she'll finish sealing the final chamber, her work complete, and she'll move on and disappear from that location entirely, with a new generation emerging months later through small circular exit holes before they too eventually fly off on their own. And once that full cycle has played out, the nest becomes fully abandoned, at which point, if the appearance of dried mud stuck to a wall is simply unwanted, it can be scraped off and the surface cleaned without any real concern. No pesticides required, no protective gear necessary, no dramatic confrontation with an angry swarm defending anything, just a bit of leftover dried mud to remove at your convenience. Long before commercial pest control services existed in any form, mud daubers had already been quietly reducing local spider populations one nest at a time, season after season, and most property owners never noticed the actual work being done. They only ever noticed the leftover mud. And the mud dauber really stands out as a striking example of an insect investing enormous effort into offspring it will genuinely never meet or interact with. Every individual chamber, every paralyzed spider gathered, and every single pellet of mud carried back represents part of a finely tuned survival strategy refined gradually over millions of years of evolution. And remarkably, all of that intricate activity remains hidden inside just a few inches of unassuming dried mud stuck to the side of a wall. It's also worth expanding a bit on how this fits into the broader picture of natural pest control around a typical home or yard. Since spiders themselves obviously play an important ecological role, but in and around structures where people live, an overabundance of certain spider species, particularly ones capable of delivering a painful or medically significant bite, isn't something most homeowners want to encourage. Having a natural predator quietly working through that population without any chemical intervention represents a genuinely useful, entirely free ecological service, one that's easy to overlook specifically because it doesn't announce itself the way an obvious pest problem might. There's no visible swarm, no repeated stings, no dramatic evidence beyond a small patch of dried mud that most people mentally file away as simply unattractive rather than recognizing it as a sign of active, ongoing pest suppression happening right on their property. It's also worth touching on just how specialized this hunting behavior actually is compared with more generalist predators. Since a mud dauber isn't randomly grabbing whatever small creature happens to cross her path, she is specifically searching out spiders, navigating into tight, hidden spaces like corners of sheds, gaps behind garage shelving, or crevices along foundation walls, precisely the kinds of locations spiders themselves tend to favor. Meaning her hunting range and search pattern is closely tuned to where her particular prey is most likely to be found. And that level of specialization is part of what makes her so effective at the specific task of spider population control, compared with a more generalized insect predator that might only occasionally happen upon a spider by chance. Another detail worth expanding on is the sheer physical effort represented by the full nest building process from start to finish, since a single female is solely responsible for locating suitable mud sources, which may not always be conveniently close to the actual nest site, meaning many of those repeated trips could involve covering meaningful distances back and forth, carrying a small mud pellet each time. And then precisely shaping and compacting that material into a stable structure capable of protecting developing offspring for an extended period. All of that occurring without any assistance whatsoever from other individuals. No division of labor, no shared workload, just one insect completing an enormous, multi-stage project entirely on her own over the course of days or weeks. It's also worth noting how this entire life cycle connects to the broader theme of parental investment in the insect world more generally, since many insects lay large numbers of eggs with minimal individual investment in each one, relying instead on sheer volume to ensure some offspring survive. But the mud dauber's approach looks almost the opposite, investing an enormous concentrated amount of individual effort and resources into each single chamber and each single egg. Essentially front-loading all of the necessary food supply before the offspring even exists, a strategy that trades quantity for a much higher degree of individual preparation and resource security per offspring. And finally, it's worth ending on the same note this whole discussion started with, that the next time one of these small, unremarkable-looking mud tubes turns up on a wall, a shed, or some quiet corner of a garage, it's worth resisting the urge to immediately reach for a can of insecticide, and instead taking a closer look at what that structure actually represents, because hidden inside a few inches of dried, hardened mud may be one of the more quietly effective, hardworking natural allies available in any backyard, doing steady, unglamorous pest control work entirely on its own, with no recognition, no assistance, and no real interest in bothering the people living nearby at all. There's more worth exploring here too, starting with how mud daubers fit into the broader family of solitary wasps as a whole. Since they're far from the only species that operates this way, solitary wasps as a group are actually far more numerous in terms of total species diversity than the social wasps most people picture when they hear the word wasp. And while social species like yellow jackets and paper wasps tend to dominate public perception simply because their colony-defending behavior makes them more noticeable and occasionally more troublesome, the vast majority of wasp species worldwide are actually solitary hunters following broadly similar strategies to the mud dauber, provisioning individual chambers or burrows with paralyzed prey before sealing them off and moving on. Meaning the mud dauber isn't some strange exception to typical wasp behavior. It's actually much closer to representing the norm across the wider wasp family, with the aggressive, colony-based species that generate most complaints and most media attention actually being the less common and less representative pattern overall. It's also worth digging a little deeper into the mechanics of that paralyzing venom itself, since the precision involved is genuinely remarkable from a biological standpoint. The venom needs to be potent enough to fully immobilize a spider, sometimes a spider considerably larger and more physically capable than the wasp delivering the sting, while also being calibrated carefully enough not to kill the prey outright, since a dead spider would begin decomposing relatively quickly. Whereas a paralyzed but living spider can remain in usable condition for the entire developmental period of the wasp larva feeding on it, which might stretch across many days or even weeks depending on conditions, and achieving that specific balance, powerful enough to immobilize completely, precise enough to preserve life functions, represents an extraordinarily fine-tuned biological adaptation, refined over an enormous span of evolutionary time. Something else worth mentioning is how the developing larva itself interacts with this stockpiled food supply once the egg hatches inside a sealed chamber. Since the larva doesn't simply consume the paralyzed spiders in a way that would immediately end the food source, it feeds gradually and strategically, generally starting with less essential body parts and structures first, a feeding pattern that keeps the remaining prey alive and viable for as long as biologically possible, maximizing the usable nutritional value of that stockpiled supply throughout the larva's entire development period before it eventually pupates and transforms into an adult wasp ready to emerge from the sealed chamber and begin the entire cycle over again on its own. It's also worth touching on nest placement itself, since mud daubers show a fairly consistent preference for sheltered, protected locations, areas shielded from direct rain and excessive temperature swings, which is part of why these nests turn up so frequently on the undersides of eaves, inside garages, tucked into shed corners, or attached to protected sections of exterior walls. since a nest exposed to the full brunt of weather would risk the mud structure breaking down or washing away entirely before the developing offspring inside had a chance to complete their full life cycle, meaning the female's selection of a nest site itself reflects a fair degree of environmental awareness and planning beyond just the construction process itself. It's worth noting as well how this entire life cycle typically unfolds across a season, since depending on regional climate, a single female may complete multiple nests or multiple chambers within a single active season, meaning the overall impact on local spider populations from just one individual wasp can add up considerably over the course of several weeks or months of consistent activity, and in regions with longer warm seasons. Successive generations may even overlap somewhat, with newly emerged adults beginning their own nest-building activities while earlier nests in the same general area are still housing developing offspring from earlier in the season. It's also worth expanding briefly on the broader ecological role solitary hunting wasps like this play within a healthy yard or garden ecosystem more generally, since natural predator populations like these tend to create a kind of ongoing low-level population regulation for whatever prey they specialize in, functioning quite differently from the dramatic boom and bust cycles sometimes seen with other pest and predator relationships. In a yard or property that supports a healthy population of solitary predatory wasps alongside other beneficial insects tends to require less intervention overall to keep various nuisance populations in check, representing one small piece of a much larger web of natural checks and balances that often gets disrupted when broad-spectrum pesticides are applied indiscriminately across a property. Since those treatments frequently affect beneficial predatory insects just as readily as they affect the pests they're intended to target. And to bring this all the way back around to the practical takeaway sitting at the heart of this whole discussion, understanding even just this one small, unassuming insect in a bit more depth tends to shift how an entire category of backyard wildlife gets perceived, since what initially looks like nothing more than an ugly smear of dried mud turns out, on closer inspection, to represent an entire hidden world of specialized hunting behavior, careful engineering, precise biological adaptation, and quietly effective pest control, all playing out in miniature just inches from where people walk past every single day without a second glance. And that shift in perspective, learning to look a little closer at the small, easily dismissed details of the natural world rather than reacting purely on instinct or unfamiliarity, tends to be just as valuable and just as interesting as the specific facts about mud daubers themselves. And there's one final angle worth adding before wrapping up entirely, which involves how easily this kind of insect gets misidentified by people encountering it for the first time, since its narrow, somewhat thread-like waist and generally dark coloration can lead to it being confused with several other stinging insects at a glance, even though its behavior and temperament differ enormously from those lookalikes. And taking just a few extra seconds to actually identify what's flying around a property, rather than reacting purely based on general wasp anxiety, can make a real practical difference in how that encounter gets handled, since treating every flying insect with a narrow waist as an equally aggressive threat tends to lead to unnecessary pesticide use, wasted effort, and the elimination of what is very often a genuinely helpful, harmless resident rather than any kind of real danger. And developing even a basic ability to distinguish a solitary mud dauber from a more defensive social species like a yellow jacket or paper wasp, largely through nest shape alone, a hardened mud tube rather than the papery, open-combed structure typical of social wasps, tends to prevent a lot of that unnecessary conflict entirely. It's also worth mentioning that curiosity about small, overlooked details like this tends to be self-reinforcing once it takes hold, because once someone learns to recognize what a mud dauber nest actually represents and understands the quiet, complex biological process behind it, that same habit of looking closer rather than reacting on instinct alone tends to carry over into how they notice all sorts of other small, easily dismissed details scattered throughout their own yard or neighborhood, whether that's a different kind of insect nest, an unusual pattern of chewed leaves, or some other small sign of activity that most people walk past without a second thought. And that shift toward genuine curiosity about the immediate natural world, rather than simple avoidance or indifference, tends to make even a very ordinary backyard feel considerably richer and more interesting over time, revealing an entire quiet ecosystem of specialized behavior and adaptation that was always present, just easily overlooked until someone actually took the time to look a little closer.